Welcome to Bendigo Art Gallery and the Burning World event, The History Under the Image. I'm Claire Needham, Curator of the Burning World exhibition at Bendigo Art Gallery. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the Dja Dja Wurrung people, traditional owners of the land on which the gallery is located, and we are streaming to you live from today. I'd like to pay my deep respects to all leaders and elders, past, present and emerging, as well as any First Nations people joining us in the audience today. It's with great pleasure that I introduce you to our guests today, Bangerang artist Peta Clancy and Dja Dja Wurrung Yorta Yorta and Jaru artist and curator Natasha Carter. In 2018, Peta was awarded the inaugural Fostering Koorie Art and Culture grant from the Koorie Heritage Trust to collaborate with the Dja Dja Wurrung community and produce the body of work Undercurrent, investigating massacre sites on Dja Dja Wurrung country, exploring an unmarked massacre site, submerged underwater, seeing this site as a metaphor for Australia's denied history of massacres. In collaboration with Peta Clancy for The Burning World, Natasha Carter has worked with Bendigo Art Gallery's collection, selecting a suite of 19th century paintings and works on paper to hang in dialogue with Peta's body of work in the gallery's oldest historic court. To give some context for our conversation today, before introducing Peta and Natasha further, I'd like to show some pre-recorded footage of the installation, currently on display at Bendigo Art Gallery, including a snippet of the immersive sound piece that accompanies the installation. After this, Peta, Natasha and I will be in conversation for the next 45 minutes. You can ask questions at any time during this via our Facebook page, which I'll present to the panel at 3:45. Hi, Peta and Natasha.
Hi.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation we're about to have. You've just had a really great insight into the really provocative and beautiful installation over at Bendigo Art Gallery currently. And I'd just like to start by chatting, Natasha, maybe you could start talking about your approach to working with Bendigo Art Gallery's historic collection.
Yeah. I'd first like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri as the traditional custodians of the land I'm currently on, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from other communities watching today. So the artwork I've chosen is in relation to the history of Jandak. My Dja Dja Wurrung ancestors have lived on this country we call Jandak for thousands of years. And in the 1800s, there was the influx of European pastoralists and squatters, which led to a heavy attempt of dispossession and many massacres of Dja Dja Wurrung people. And this is a common history found all over Australia. It didn't take long for gold to be found, which resulted in further devastation and destruction. And to survive this change, Jara adapted to white settler practices. And this adaptation was not from a desire for the European lifestyle, but as a result of the environmental destruction happening around them, which disrupted the agricultural, social, and spiritual practices cultivated over thousands of years and many generations. Acknowledging that history, I feel, is an important part of the healing process, and it needs to be addressed and discussed. Nobody says it'll be an easy discussion, but it's one that needs to be had, and I think art is a great way of beginning that discussion. So the artwork that I've selected from Bangerang Art Gallery's historic collection depicts the landscape of Dja Dja and life during that gold rush period. And it's all artwork that's depicted through a European lens. So while many artists painted what they saw, they often overlooked or didn't see the evidence of that thousands of years of Indigenous land management and cultural life. And so I think what I want to do out of the artwork that I selected was another way of looking at these images, not just what you can see, but what you don't see within that artwork. And the way I've done the hang is sort of like a timeline of that disruption of the landscape. And that's what there's a gold seam line that some might have noticed from that video earlier, which calls back to that gold rush history, which is a major bedrock of that disruption and destruction of the environment. And I think the narration that I've tried to put forward with the artworks I've selected, I think complements the story of Peter's work, and that heavy history that we need to discuss.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's fantastic. And you've really picked up on the works that you've selected also from the collection. You know, they're not often the sort of iconic, epic pieces that might tell a very dominant colonial narrative, but you've really picked up on that sort of lived experience and the stories or the works that depict sort of everyday life at that time. But then at the same time, you know, you're looking at and illuminating the things that are missing or the things that are being overlooked within that image. And that's something that you're really drawing to the surface, Peter, through your work.
Yeah, exactly. So my work was created after spending time on country. I collaborated with Mick Burke and Amos Atkinson, who are Dja Dja Wurrung traditional owners, and we spent time on country exploring massacre sites on Dja Dja Wurrung country. And we went to a number of different sites. We stepped back a bit. We didn't kind of want to go on to the actual sites themselves, but the site that I ended up making the Undercurrent series of was a site that we went to, and it particularly had a particular feel, and it is a massacre site that's underwater. So the river went along in a particular trajectory, and since invasion, the waterway has been flooded, and so the site where the violence occurred, and also where the riverbank where people lived for thousands of years is now covered underwater. And as you mentioned, Claire, I found it particularly evocative because the fact that it's hidden, this massacre site's hidden, it's underwater, is a metaphor for the fact that we don't talk, in the general populace, we don't talk a lot about the violence that occurred to First Nations people in Australia upon invasion. And what's really interesting also about this site is that when we were there, Amos said that it's really good that the site's underwater because it's protected, and the water is healing the spirits, and also that people can't access the area, so it's protected by the water. And So I spent about a year returning to this site and photographing the site over many, many months at different times of the day through different seasons. And I allowed the site to speak to me through the photographs that I took.
So you talk about the water covering over the site. And Natasha, I know we've also had conversations through the development of this project about the landscape holding those stories. And even though settlement has covered over the land and the land has changed and the shape of the land, the gold rush meant that there was excavation in the land. There's been, flooding of the landscape. But you talk, Natasha, about the land holding those stories. Perhaps you could illuminate a little bit more about that.
Yeah. In the previous discussions we've talked about how old written accounts of the environment, you can still see what they were talking about today. And so time's passed, but even with all the environmental destruction, to a degree, the environment hasn't changed, the landscape hasn't changed, because it still holds the major foundations of our country. A common thing that we call Jandak is upside down country, because of the gold mining process and how things are, how the soil is dug up and overturned and tilled, means that a lot of the history that would be below the surface is brought to the top. And so in regards to artefacts, it's quite common to find things that are hundreds, thousands of years old on the surface. They shouldn't be there. They don't have that soil protecting them. But the site that Peter went to, it has the water over it, which, protects it. And that is quite unusual for our country, just because of how much of the impact that has happened.
And in terms of that idea, I guess, of the landscape holding those stories and bringing those to the fore, Peter, in your work, you look at the past and the present, and you bring those two into the same image. So you're really sort of you bring it's sort of a traverses time in that way. And so in part of your technique also of working with the site and the photographs and the way that you actually kind of constructed the image of the site too is an interesting way of thinking about the stories across time.
Exactly. So through the photographs that I created for the series, I wanted to convey a sense of multiple perspectives and a sense of multiple ways of understanding the landscape, and also a sense of this traumatic history in the landscape. And so what I did was I spent a lot of time photographing the landscape with my 5.4 camera, and these photographs were straight photographs in terms of depicting what was there. And then I went through a process of selecting images and printing those images, and then returning to the landscape with the prints and putting the prints onto a frame which I placed in the landscape. And I would position the print at exactly the same place where I took the original photographs. And I would cut into the photograph in roughly around the horizon line. And then I re-photographed the photograph in the site at exactly the same place I took the original photographs. And so in the photographs, there's two different perspectives, two different ways of perceiving the landscape. There's also a line that's kind of like a cut or a scarring through the landscape as well, which is the line between where the actual photograph of the landscape exists as well as the landscape behind that I photographed. And so it's that I wanted to convey that sense of the landscape and holding this history, but also multiple histories, multiple ways of understanding the landscape, because the people that I actually saw at that site were were potentially unaware of this traumatic history that occurred at that particular site. And also when people view we saw an installation shot of the exhibition previously in the video. And the way that I show the work is that I have a large prints onto wallpaper which are applied directly onto the wall. So they're really large and they cover the whole wall. And those particular images are upside down, so the landscape is inverted. So it gives that sense of you know, the landscape and the traumatic history of everything kind of being turned upside down. But then I have the framed photographs of the layering that I mentioned previously. And sorry, that's a digger in the background. I have the photographs that are rephotographed with the layering. I overlay those on top of the wallpaper, and with those particular layering photographs, my hope is that when the viewer looks at those photographs, they see the landscape that they're looking at, but they also get a sense that there's something not quite right, because there are two different multiple perspectives of the same landscape in the one photograph. So there's something a bit disorienting, which is, and you know, the line and the cutting is also a reference to the trauma that's held in the landscape. There's so much of the area throughout Australia. You know, these sites of violence are not acknowledged, but it's all there, I think.
And in terms of that acknowledgement as well, it's such a respectful acknowledgement of that history. And Natasha, I know you've talked about you know, Peter's approach as well, in terms of, you know, the very visceral response of a Dja Dja Wurrung person in these sites and these histories. And perhaps you could talk about also your own response to that in the way that you incorporated as well that line around the space, which as well is like a scar through the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the gold line that I've got going through the space, there's also a quartz line to start it off. And it lines up with the horizon line that Peta has in her work. Creates a continuity throughout the space. I started off with the quartz line because quartz and gold go hand in hand. But it's the quartz that Aboriginal people find more important. It has a use. In terms of day-to-day life, gold doesn't really have much of a purpose apart from today's modern currency and jewellery and all that. But quartz was a integral part of Dja Dja Wurrung life. And so I wanted that line that goes through the space to represent the Aboriginal history before all of the gold mining, which is depicted in a lot of the work that I've selected. But I also wanted it to be kind of like a subtle reminder as you're looking at these works of what this is all about. So making sure that when you're looking at the work, you're thinking about the history behind the imagery and not just simply what the picture depicts. So it carries through the whole space.
And it's that shared history as well. So it's these, you know, images from a very Eurocentric perspective, but then you're, you know, also bringing forward and, you know, amplifying and centering the First Nations experience of that exact same history, but from a very different perspective. And you also the resilience of First Nations people in the Dja Dja Wurrung community that travels all the way through, you know, the line continues all the way around the space and keeps on going all the way through your work and then Peter's work as well with that horizon. I wonder if we could bring up some of those installation views to be able to see, for people to really get that sense of how that's working in the space. Also within the space is a sound piece that, Peter, you recorded on site at the Massacre site as well, actually in the water, giving you that sort of immersive feeling within the exhibition space and also bringing that site really into the space. I don't think the sound's playing at this point. I think they're just still images. Perhaps, Peter, you could talk a little bit more about that, I guess, the sort of immersive feeling that you're trying to create within the exhibition space as well.
Sure. So part of the reason why I work with the wallpaper prints is so that when people view the work, their peripheral vision is fully immersed, so that, you know, there's a real sense of kind of being challenged about preconceptions of or their views or experiences of the landscape, and to also explore that idea that I mentioned previously about being kind of disoriented in this particular landscape, because the idea of being disoriented is that the fact that so many sites, so many areas throughout Australia have these multiple histories, and people might see particular areas in one way. So, for example, the site which I mentioned, people actually go there and they kind of enjoy the water, and if they kind of knew the history, but I would kind of wonder whether people actually would feel that history, because you couldn't not. So, you know, I really want there to be a kind of a visceral, immersive feeling in the landscape, of the landscape in the installation. And to do this, I also worked with a hydrophone, which is a microphone that you can put underwater. And so I just had this idea that I wanted to hear what the sound was like at this sunken massacre site. I mean, I didn't expect, you know, there to be kind of, you know, something kind of really eerie, but I just thought it was quite an evocative idea. So I created a multi-channel soundscape that I play, so that, you know, there's a further sensory immersive experience for the viewers when viewing the installation.
And really, as a viewer as well, it really sort of, I guess, it locates you. You're in the gallery space and you're contemplating the works, and then it locates you on site as well, again, in the same way that your images sort of conflate time and bring the past into the present together in that space in order to contemplate the histories. It also, as a viewer, sort of places you in that legacy and makes you contemplate, you know, your own part of that story and that shared history as well.
Exactly. In some ways, it's also it's absolutely impossible to, you know, the history is so horrific, and the history in the Australian landscape, it's impossible to depict in photographs. So it is an impossible project. But I think if the viewer is brought into the landscape through the installation and is maybe challenged in terms of their preconceptions, or is disoriented, maybe they might think of the landscape in a different way.
In the same way that you're constructing that image too, you're putting, you know, constructing the image with the two views of the same site together, so that you are sort of disorientating the viewer, but also in a similar way, you know, the construction of the view of the landscape of the colonial works as well that you're working with, Natasha. You know, it's a lens on the landscape and on what was happening at the time, from a very particular worldview that was, you know, brought with settlers and those that came at the time of the gold rushes.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, to look at Peter's work without context and just to see the environment, and then if you were then told what those images were of, I think it makes you question when you go about your day-to-day life, where you're walking, where you stand, where you live, what are the stories of that landscape? Do you actually know what happened there? And I think that landscape imagery, plus the artwork I selected from the art gallery's historic collection, the paintings that I picked are all images that have all been hung in the gallery space before, and so regulars to the gallery will have seen these paintings, and hopefully they're now looking at these images a different way and thinking about them in a different way, actually thinking about the backstory behind all of that work.
There's a really interesting image that I remember. So Natasha and you and I spent a lot of time working in the collection store, looking through all of the works in our collection that are from the 19th century, and all the images that depict Dja Dja Wurrung country. And there was one particular image that really caught your attention. I think it became sort of a central point for which you built the rest of the experience of the exhibition and the works that you selected. And perhaps we can have that up on the screen if that's okay. That's the Forest Creek diggings. It's a woodcut piece that would have appeared in the London Illustrated News. So it was a piece that would have been printed and then travelled back to England to depict life on the diggings at the time.
Yeah. And it's... I found this image really interesting because I was staring at it for so long and I couldn't quite pinpoint what it is necessarily about it that really drew me to it. And then I realised in the foreground there's two Aboriginal men. So if you look on the bottom right, there's two Aboriginal men in uniform. And the way they're depicted is really, really important, really unusual for its time, I think. They're in uniform and they're not in a position of deference to anybody else in that image. There's no white officers in a higher position than them. So to have them depicted like that and something that's gone international in that time is really, really interesting, really powerful, and the way they're shown is it's these men are portrayed overseeing a site that there's a lot of history of Dja Dja Wurrung people in uniform, whether it's tracks or officers or something like that. And so these are quite possibly Dja Dja Wurrung men on country at Mount Alexander, which we call Lianganuk. And I thought that was a really important image to have as a focal point. The way I put it in the hang is so that when you actually walk into the space, it's directly in front of you at the far wall, lining up with the doorway. I think it was really important to make it a focal point of the images that I chose.
And to talk about a little bit too, we had conversations about the depiction of First Nations community in those artworks and at the time, and how that shaped an understanding or an impression of. And you've talked about now wanting to really centre that First Nations perspective in order to really challenge those preconceptions and that understanding and the legacy of that. Yeah.
A lot of the artwork that we looked at, the few times that Aboriginal people are portrayed, it's usually whether it's caricatures or positions of subservience to somebody else. I think a lot of the artworks that I picked don't have a lot of Aboriginal people in them, and there's a heavy focus more on the landscape and what's happening around in that history in that time. That image I thought was just really important to have, just because it was so unusual to see.
Peter, I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit about your work with Amos Atkinson and Mick Burke and being on country together, and in terms of depictions of the landscape, but also historical records of the landscape and the historical records of massacre sites or the lack of.
Sure. So we spent, as I mentioned previously, we spent time travelling through Dja Dja Wurrung country, visiting or in the vicinity of particular sites, and we went to sites which through oral histories known through oral history for Dja Dja Wurrung people. But we also went to some sites which were recorded on a Dja Dja Wurrung massacre map. So they were put together specifically documenting sites through archival material. And there's, from memory, I can't remember exactly how many sites are on that map, but maybe there's 7 or 8. And we travelled to a number of these sites. But there was one particular point where we were driving across a bridge crossing the Coloban River, I think it was, and I'd been there before because I drove around myself, kind of visiting some of the sites that I'd read about in archival notes, and we drove over this bridge, and then I realised that it was this particular site that I'd been reading about. There was an account of what had actually happened at this site that was written by the Chief Protector, Robinson, at the time. And he'd gone to investigate a report of a massacre that happened at this site. And as we kind of pulled over, we were driving across the bridge, and then we pulled over to the side, and I was reading out this account that was written 1850s, and it gave a depiction of this particular landscape that we were looking at, and it also discussed what had actually happened there. And there was this idea that a depiction of a hut and then a hill over in the north direction, and it was exactly this site that we were at, and it was really, really, really strange. And so we got out of the car and we walked around a bit, and we came across, or Mick actually came across a greenstone axe just by chance. But what was really interesting is when we were at that site, we talked to Mick and Amos about what the site would have looked like previously and how the reeds would have been much more prolific, and it was very much a feeling of kind of going back in time. But Mick also works for the Department of Environment, and he works a lot with fire, and he talks about the healing nature of fire. So from us going to this particular site, he was inspired to organise an event. Sorry, there's Mozzie. To organise an event. Sorry, a ceremony which would bring together ancestors of the people who were murdered at the site and Dja Dja Wurrung traditional owners, and he would actually do like a burning ceremony to heal the site. I think that's also a really interesting way, like talking about marking sites. I think, or the fact that like it's very, very controversial in terms of how the idea of massacres, how the history of massacres at particular sites, how you convey the history of sites to Western audience, like to Western visitors to the sites. But this particular, was just really interesting in terms of drawing on oral histories and knowledge of and visceral kind of experiences of massacre sites on Dja Dja Wurrung country, but also drawing on archival material as well.
Mm. And in terms of those, that acknowledgement you're talking about, how you acknowledge those sites, acknowledge these histories, bringing them to the fore in ways that can move forward in healing. Natasha, you mentioned that before. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that process and about that, I guess, collaboration that took place in terms of your work with Mick and Amos, Peter, and then our work together at the gallery, and really sort of bringing those stories forward in order to talk about them, to acknowledge them, and then the way forward from there.
Yeah. It's really important to have this discussion for healing, and acknowledging this history that we have, this violent history that we have, all over Australia, really, not just here. It needs to be addressed. Otherwise, there's trauma and there's pain, and you can't heal from a process you don't discuss. And to do it through art, I think is a really great way of starting that discussion and bringing people in. It transcends languages to do it through art, and I think there's a lot of cultures that would find a understanding in this violent history.
Because the scar as well. I mean, in some cultures, scarring is, the pain and trauma is to be sort of, pushed to covered up. Whereas I guess in some cultures, scarring is also, it's about resilience. It's about wearing that scar and having it present. And you talk, in terms of your inclusion of that gold seam around the installation as well, that's a scar through the landscape, and it's making that visible and present. And Peter, in a similar way with your work too, you've made that cut through the landscape and your image very present and very, at the forefront as well.
Yes. I think I also worked with light, the idea of light and dark, and light cut through the landscape for the installation. But I also wanted to kind of acknowledge that for some, I remember Mick and Amos was saying that they went with some elders to a site that was nearby the site where I took the photographs, and people couldn't stay there. Like, it was they felt physically ill and within their bodies. So I have deep respect that I was given the trust to explore this aspect of history and to bring that kind of to the fore, but to also collaborate with Mick and Amos, and I just wanted to deeply acknowledge the trust that I was given, and that I really hoped that I did something very respectful for Dja Dja Wurrung people. It was quite challenging at the opening of the first time I showed the work at the Koorie Heritage Trust, when there were a number of elders and Dja Dja Wurrung traditional owners who were there, and I was really hoping that people took the work in the way that the sentiments that I'd created it.
Which was so much. Such a rich conversation, and thank you so much for sharing, both of you, for sharing all your insights today. I think we've come to the point where we've got some time for questions from the audience. Anyone listening has any questions to put forward? I'm just going to, check my phone, so it's not having some connectivity. If anyone has any questions that they would like to put forward for Peter or Natasha, please pop those up on Facebook. In terms of also thinking about the, the collaborative process of working with First Nations stories, histories, and First Nations communities, perhaps Natasha or Peter could talk about that process, and I guess, really positive and excellent ways of going about doing that.
Natasha, do you want?
Yeah. I think the most integral part, is making sure that any First Nations group is actually a part of the planning process from the beginning. Not a part of the final steps or something. It's just very important, I think, for us to be in those initial steps and to help guide the discussion and how things progress. It's a more genuine interaction then, I feel, for us to be a part of the process from the beginning, as opposed to I guess really feeling like it's all about ticking a box. I think, just making sure we're part of it from the beginning, I think, is the biggest help to making sure that First Nations people are a part of any process.
I also do think too, in terms of that, from the beginning, not just as a, to be consulted and then, not following through all the way through the project as well, and really centering First Nations voice all the way through the project. Not necessarily a preconceived idea of what it would look like at the end, but actually openness and spending that time and being present and having those conversations. And I guess too, Peter, in terms of your working with the site as well, it was a years-long visits, almost monthly, weekly. You're spending a lot of time. You're really sitting with the site, and you're really letting those stories come to the fore. And it's a time spent as well.
Exactly. So it's about like a collaboration with traditional owners in a very genuine way, and it's about taking the time and developing relationships with people and maintaining those relationships over time in a very genuine way. And I think that's really true, Natasha, of fostering relationships and involving First Nations people from the inception of a project.
We've got some questions coming through from those that are listening today. So Michelle says, you mentioned an area where there was violence and you mentioned reeds in the background. Are you able to be specific about the site? That also brings up a conversation that we've had also in the past too, Peter, around that idea of acknowledging sites and marking them. And in some cases, it's actually better not to highlight a site in terms of respectfully acknowledging and keeping that site and the stories that it holds.
Exactly. So for me, it was the site that I worked with is an unmarked and an unnamed site, and it's not my kind of, even though I worked at that site, it's not my story to say, I'm not a Dja Dja Wurrung person, and it's not my story to say where the site is, because I think with talking about and making work about massacre sites is it needs to be, and acknowledging sites, it needs to be, there needs to be autonomy and ownership from Dja Dja Wurrung people. However, having said that, there's a lot of archival material that you can look up, and specifically massacre sites. Like there's the Victorian Aboriginal Massacre map, which you can actually access online, which was put together in 1988 for the bicentennial by the Koorie Heritage Trust. And that outlines about 56 sites throughout Victoria where massacres occurred. And so there is public knowledge of particular sites. That particular site that I was mentioning with the reeds, that might be on the Victorian Aboriginal Massacre map. It was on the map, the Dja Dja Wurrung map that I had. But there is a number of documentation that you can find which outlines where massacres occurred. But the thing about these accounts in the public knowledge is that they're from a particular perspective. So they're from the perspective of the perpetrators, and they were written a long time ago. So, and also Mick said, so the number of say Dja Dja Wurrung people that were murdered at massacre sites, Mick always said, add an extra 0. So from what's written in the official records, add, it's very underestimated.
So really lovely question coming in from Rodney saying, from a personal perspective, has this been healing, this installation, this process been healing for you and Peter and Natasha?
I think, yes, it has been. And I think it's, as much as I knew about my own history, about my people's history and the history of Jandak, I think working on this project has given me a deeper understanding, because I'm looking at it through so many different lenses. I've gotten the story from my own people, but then to also look at how it's been written about. It's enlightening, but I think personally it's put me on a journey of healing, I think.
Creating the work was very much it was a very emotional kind of process, and understanding, like it actually took me, when I had the original idea to make the work about massacre sites, it was something that I had a particular idea in my mind, but actually visiting on country with Mick and Amos and talking to them and actually being on country at sites of such violence, it actually brought it so much more to the fore in terms of almost seeing kind of blood in the soil, and it made it incredibly real and terrifying. In terms of healing, I'm honoured that the work is on Dja Dja Wurrung country now, and I'm just really happy. It'd be wonderful if we were there now, but I'm really happy that it's made it there, and it's kind of an offering that it's on its traditional home. And
I think, Peter, you've done it in a really respectful way, and I think seeing your work and the way you've done it, I think, has helped with, I think, my own healing and understanding of my story. So I think, it's nice to see it from another Aboriginal person as well, to do this work. You have another understanding of how we might want our story told and portrayed, which is intrinsic to our histories. I think it's very, very well done.
Oh, thank you. It was very challenging, kind of, because my ancestry is Bangerang, and it's not my stories, and I was entrusted with this particular knowledge, and I understand how it's very difficult to kind of talk about, and it's very personal as well. So yeah, I mean, we're talking about it, this history now, and fostering conversations. And I remember one of the first times I spoke to Rodney Carter, the CEO of the Dja Dja Wurrung Clan's Aboriginal Corporation, who really embraced the idea of me doing the project, and he said it's about truth telling. And but it is very kind of personal to different people from different areas. But it's important to really talk about this so that we have a real relationship with traditional owners, but also with where we live.
Yeah,
it's all it's all covered over.
There's a question that's just come through to ask about what's next for you, Natasha and Peter, and both being artists as well. And you've talked about art being a really important way of working through all of this as well. And wonder whether you could talk a little bit, Natasha, perhaps first about what's next for you within your creative practice.
Doing a lot of art. I've just moved, so I now have space to just focus on my artwork, which is really nice. But I think in recent years I've I think, gotten a deeper connection to my culture, and I think I'm putting that through in my artwork, and I feel like I have a more solid grounding and understanding of who I am in my culture and my background, and so more artwork from me that's focusing on my story and the story of my peoples, because I come from 3 different nations, so similar stories, but all so different as well. So I think more artwork in those areas.
Yeah, definitely more artwork, and to be able to travel on country and not be limited to 5Ks. No. So I have been invited to make work about significant sites on my ancestral country. So it's a matter of spending time and fostering relationships.
Thank you so much for your time today, Peter and Natasha. And I'd just like to also acknowledge what an honour it's been to work with both of you on this project, and how I'm so pleased that people hopefully will be able to see it soon and actually be in the space and really have that time and space for contemplation as well. And thank you so much for all of the ongoing work that you do as well. So I just I think we're coming to the end of our chat. So thank you also for all of you who have put forward questions. Somebody also has posted a link to the Massacre map too for people who are interested to have a look at that. I'd just like to thank our partners Bendigo Venue and Events, in particular today's technician Callum McClure for navigating us through all of our technical things. And thank you so much to everyone who joined in the conversation today. And please do check out the Burning World section of our website. There's a lot of really great content on there, including a conversation between Peter and Amos Atkinson and Mick Burke on country during the development of the Undercurrent work. That's a really fascinating and insightful listen as well. And there's some really, Peter also talking about her work, and then Natasha extending a little bit more, talking about the installation. So please head there to have a look at some really great resources as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Natasha and Peter, and everybody listening in.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Claire. And thanks for the invitation to participate in this amazing project with Natasha and yourself.